1787. The maid with the burn on her face and the creepy revenge. Welcome to the chronicle of one of the quietest and coldest acts of revenge ever told in the history of colonial Virginia. Before we turn the first pages, I invite you to share in the comments where you are listening from and at what moment of the day or night. We are curious to know where this story of silence and retribution has echoed across the world. It was the year 1787. The sweltering Virginia heat seemed to press down on the vast land where endless tobacco fields stretched out under the labor of black hands. They, though called free after the Revolution, were still bound by debt and fear. This vast plantation was the empire of the Harrington family, built on the sweat and blood of generations. On a late afternoon, as the blazing sun stained the sky red, a 9-year-old girl stood on a wooden porch. Her small, bare feet trembled on the dusty ground. Before her, her parents lay motionless, their blood soaking into the parched earth, its metallic scent mingling with the acrid smell of dry tobacco leaves. She did not cry. The girl just stood there, one hand clutching the torn hem of her dress, the other clenched into a fist, her nails digging into her own flesh. Her dark eyes did not look down at her parents' bodies, but stared intently at the master and mistress, who still held hot hunting rifles in their hands. The burn scar on her right cheek twitched in the twilight, a permanent reminder of the pain that had been seared into her skin long before this tragedy. Master Harrington and his wife stood a few paces away, their hunting rifles still radiating heat. He, with a silver-white beard that contrasted with his flushed face, tried to maintain an air of calm, but his cold blue eyes darted between the bodies and the child, unable to find a resting place. His once clean linen coat was now speckled with flecks of blood that would forever haunt his conscience. Beside him, the mistress, in a now stained white silk dress, clutched her rifle. Her manicured fingers gripped the wooden stock. Her high-pinned hair was unnervingly neat amidst the chaos, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. They had been mistaken. They thought her parents were slaves plotting an uprising, but they were just a poor couple trying to escape the shackles of debt. In their haste and inherent arrogance, they had made a mistake that could never be erased. The girl's dark eyes flashed in the dying light, sharp and unwavering. The burn scar on her cheek seemed to redden, telling its own story of violence and survival, of nights when fire had licked at her shabby wooden cabin and left its permanent mark on her face. She had already experienced too much pain to believe that words could heal anything. She had seen enough to know that apologies meant nothing. Words, no matter how sweet, could not bring back her mother's hand to gently stroke the scar on her cheek. They could not bring back her father's deep laugh as he told her stories of freedom, of a better life he had dreamed of. Around them, other slaves lingered at the edge of the tobacco fields, their faces taut with fear and powerless fury. They said nothing. They couldn't. They knew all too well that silence was the only way to survive, that any sound of protest, a whisper or a cry for justice, could turn those barrels toward them. The girl's shoulders stiffened as the mistress finally stepped forward, her voice trembling as she tried to form practiced words. "It was just a mistake," she whispered, her voice thin and artificial, as if a confession could wash away the blood drying on the ground. She bent down, her shadow falling over the girl, trying to catch her eye. "Come inside. You'll be safe here." Safe. The word echoed hollowly in the air, thick with the smell of tobacco. Safety had been her mother's soft humming as they sat together mending torn clothes, turning scraps of fabric into comfort. Safety had been her father's strong arms as he lifted her onto his shoulders, showing her the stars and telling her they would always guide her. That safety was gone now, buried in the dust with the only two people in the world who had loved her unconditionally. Master Harrington cleared his throat, stepping closer, his shadow engulfing her small frame. His voice was steady, but a tremor lay hidden beneath the feigned composure. "From now on, we will take care of you," he said, as if the words could erase the crime just committed. "You will stay here. You will have everything you need." The girl didn't move, her dark eyes lifted to meet his, her gaze steady and cold. For the first time that afternoon, the powerful man had to look away. It was no longer the gaze of an innocent child. Something inside her had shattered and frozen over the moment the gunshots rang out. A simmering hatred coiled deep in her chest and would never leave her. When they finally brought her into the house, the night seemed to swallow her whole. The large main house was suffocating in its silence. The high walls were lined with oil paintings of Harrington ancestors, their painted eyes looking down on her with scrutiny and contempt. Her bare feet padded across the polished pine floors, every creak echoing in the empty space. The smell of pine and chimney smoke hung heavy in the air, a foreign and oppressive scent. She hated it instantly. That night, they bathed her, scrubbing away the blood and dust until her skin burned under the coarse cloth. They dressed her in a stiff white dress, its lace collar rubbing against the burn scar on her cheek, causing a sharp sting. At the dining table, where silver goblets glittered in the candlelight, they placed a plate of smoked ham and golden cornbread before her. She didn't touch a bite. She sat in silence, her small feet dangling above the polished floor, her eyes fixed on the plates, her face a mask, only the scar seeming to twitch in the flickering light. Across the table, the mistress avoided her gaze entirely, her eyes fixed on her untouched glass of whiskey, while the master drowned himself in spirits, the clink of his silver cup against the table sounding like a slow death knell. In the days that followed, the house operated with an eerie precision, as if the tragedy on the porch had never happened. The mistress tried to teach her to sew, but her posture was always rigid, her voice clipped, as if distance could erase her guilt. The master spoke of atonement, of the chance for a better life, of raising her as one of their own. But even as they dressed her in clean dresses, even as they brought her into the kitchen to observe and learn, they never called her by her real name. To them, she was simply the girl. At night, in the small, damp room behind the kitchen, she would sit by the narrow window, knees pulled to her chest, and look out at the moonlit tobacco fields. The wind rustled through the broad leaves, carrying the chirping of insects and the mournful hoot of a distant owl. In the darkness, she would whisper her parents' names, her voice soft but firm, promising them she would never forget. She would always remember. By the end of the first week, the other slaves on the plantation had learned to avoid her gaze. There was something in those dark, unwavering eyes, coupled with the puckered scar, that made even the bravest men shudder. A sharpness, a terrifying patience, a silent promise of a coming storm. The mistress no longer tried to speak to her. Her guilt had soured into a cold formality. The master, however, continued to watch her, his gaze heavy and wary, as if he could sense the fire of hatred simmering inside the small, silent girl with the ruined face. And so she remained, a ghost gliding through the walls of the great house. Her hands learned the movements of the kitchen, her feet memorized every hidden corner, every creaking floorboard, every locked door. She spoke little, smiled even less, and in the quiet hours of the night, when the world was asleep and the only sound was the wind whispering through the tobacco fields, she repeated her vow like a prayer, that one day they would feel the pain she felt, lose what she had lost, and understand too late what it meant to be utterly alone. The years passed, but time did not wear away the sharp edges of her memory. The girl with the scar on her face grew into a young woman, tall and slender. Her body was shaped by endless days in the kitchen and sleepless nights staring at the damp ceiling of her small room. The house had become her world, a cage decorated with mahogany and quiet wealth. She learned to move through its corridors with a silent precision that unsettled all who caught her shadow. From the beginning, they had decided she must be made useful. The mistress called it an opportunity, as if the word could erase the gunshots that still echoed in her mind. "She's a bright one," the mistress would say to anyone who would listen. "Quick hands, a mind like a sponge." And so the girl was given to the family's old cook, an elderly black woman named Eliza, whose rough hands and sharp tongue often hid a kindness she rarely showed. Eliza taught her everything: how to bake cornbread until it was golden and fragrant, how to smoke pork with hickory until it was rich with flavor, how to create sauces from local herbs, the language of the land that only people like them understood. She learned to grind spices with a mortar and pestle, to marinate meat overnight, and to read the language of fire and smoke. But more importantly, she realized that food could be a weapon, a bit of a poisonous leaf from the forest, a strange mushroom growing behind the barn, could turn a meal into a scythe. By the age of 14, she could cook delicate French dishes like rabbit ragout or spicy Spanish paellas that made the Harringtons' guests marvel. They praised the little girl for her natural talent, never knowing that every dish was practice, every herb an experiment. Her hands were swift, her movements precise, and her memory was perfect. She never needed to be told a recipe twice. She never forgot an ingredient, and she never forgot her vow. In the kitchen, she was a phantom, quiet, efficient, and almost invisible unless she was needed. She worked in silence, her expression unnervously calm, but her dark eyes never stopped watching. She watched the other slaves, the housekeepers, the master and mistress, and the guests who came and went in their silk finery and cloying perfumes. Nothing escaped her notice. She catalogued every detail, every whisper, every furtive glance, like notes written in invisible ink, saved for a future only she could see. To the Harringtons, she became something between a servant and a trophy, a living testament to their twisted charity. "She's family," the mistress would say to her friends over afternoon tea, her voice soft and well-rehearsed. "We've given her everything. She shall want for nothing as long as she is with us." But there were always unspoken rules, sharp as knives. She could stand in the dining room, but never sit at the table. She could prepare lavish meals, but never taste them unless ordered to. She could wear clean dresses, the soft fabric hiding the burn scar on her cheek, but she was never, ever to forget her place. At night, when the house fell silent and the crickets chirped in the darkness outside, she would lie awake on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house's heartbeat. She could hear the master's heavy footsteps in the hall, the creak of the floorboards under his weight, the mistress's whispers to the overseer, the clink of a wineglass, and the hollow laughter that never quite made it past the thick kitchen walls. And through it all, she remained silent, her eyes wide open in the dark, cold as a blade. By 16, she had become the heart of the kitchen. Eliza was slowing down, her hands stiffening with age, and she filled the gaps flawlessly. She was up before dawn to light the fire, kneading bread dough in the gray morning light. While the family slept, she would have the strong coffee brewed that could wake the dead and the meat marinating with a precision that would silence the most discerning guests. She moved through the kitchen as if she were born to it. Every step was measured, every movement fluid, her body remembering everything even as her mind wandered to a much darker place. The other slaves whispered about her when they thought she wasn't listening. They whispered about her silence, about the way she moved like a ghost, about how her dark eyes seemed to see right through people, stripping them down to their smallest secrets. They whispered about the burn scar that stretched across her face, a permanent, dark red mark, and about how her expression never changed, no matter what happened. She was a mystery to them, a shadow on the periphery of their lives, and it made them both respectful and uneasy. At dinner, when the Harringtons gathered in the grand dining room, she would move silently between the table and the kitchen, refilling wine glasses, replacing plates, her presence as discreet as the linen tablecloth. She never spoke unless spoken to, never made a sound as she placed the rabbit stew before the master or cleared the plates from the mistress's side. But sometimes, when no one was looking, her gaze would linger a moment too long. On the master as he laughed with his guests, on the mistress as she cast a furtive glance at the overseer, and on the family portraits that hung on the walls, their painted eyes looking down on her like judging phantoms. The guests noticed it too, though they never said anything. Some were unnerved by her steady gaze, as if they could feel a cold draft emanating from her. Others were completely oblivious, too absorbed in their own reflections in the silver goblets. But the servants saw everything. They saw the way her eyes lingered, the way her hands tightened ever so slightly on the edge of a silver tray, the way her face never cracked, and they whispered all the more. By 17, she was no longer merely a servant. She was the one the mistress trusted with the menus for every party, the one the master called for whenever an important guest needed to be impressed. She held the keys to the spice cabinet and the storeroom, had authority over the other slaves and kitchen staff, and commanded the silent respect of everyone who worked under that great roof. But with that respect came a fear, the kind that grows in the dark, quiet and heavy. Despite her perfect obedience, there was something about her that no one could name but everyone could feel. It was in the way she stood tall and still, her apron always clean, her hair pulled back neatly, her eyes sharp as knives. It was in the way she never flinched when the master raised his voice, in the way she never smiled at the mistress's small kindnesses, and in the way her silence carried more weight than 1,000 words. And yet, in the kitchen, amidst the familiar rhythm of work, she found a strange peace. The steady chop of a knife through vegetables, the sizzle of meat in a hot cast-iron skillet, the slow, patient stirring of sauces that required time and attention. They had become a language she understood better than any spoken word. She did not need to speak to be heard here. The kitchen listened to her, and in its low hum, she had built walls high enough to keep the world out. But even in those moments when the scent of garlic and rosemary filled the space, and the mansion above seemed a world away, the memories never slept. They came in flashes: her father's voice, her mother's smile, the crack of the gunshot, and the salty taste of dust as she fell to the ground. She carried it all with her, a steady, silent weight that had forged her into something sharp and unbreakable. By 18, the transformation was complete. The frightened child who had stood barefoot on the porch, staring at her parents' bodies, was gone. In her place was a young woman honed by silence and survival, her face an unreadable mask, her dark eyes bright and watchful. The master and mistress now called her family, praised her as their pride, their living atonement. But deep in the quiet of the kitchen, with her hands stained by herbs from hours of work and a mind sharper than the knife she kept honed to perfection, she knew the truth. She was not theirs. She never had been, and she would never forget it. In her mid-20s, the girl with the scarred face had become the silent shadow that held the entire mansion together. Years of obedience, silence, and an almost frightening discipline had turned her into someone the Harringtons relied upon without a second thought. She no longer worked just in the kitchen. She managed the entire household, her authority extending to the maids, the gardeners, and the stable boys. Her footsteps made no sound in the wide corridors, but her presence carried an invisible weight. With a single glance, she could have a room cleaned, a meal prepared, or a fire roaring in the drawing room before the master even thought to ask. She was the perfect servant, a model of silent gratitude and loyalty. Her apron was always crisp and white, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, not a single strand out of place. She spoke softly when addressed, answered with quiet efficiency, and always bowed her head at a compliment. To the Harringtons, she was living proof of their generosity, of their atonement. They boasted about her to guests, calling her our girl, and said she was the backbone of the house. In response, she would only smile, a gentle, polite curve of her lips that revealed nothing and promised even less. But beneath that calm exterior, her silence had been forged into something sharp. She carried the memory of that fateful afternoon like a burn, not just on her face, but seared into her very bones, a wound that never healed, no matter how many years passed. When the house was filled with laughter during parties, when the silver goblets clinked and the fiddles sang through the great rooms, her eyes would linger just a second too long on the family portraits lining the walls. The frozen smiles of wealth and power looked down on her. They never noticed. They never saw. By day, she moved with a quiet authority, her hands steady, her voice calm. She knew the rhythm of this house better than anyone. She anticipated every need before it was spoken, managed the other slaves with precision, and kept the entire mansion running so smoothly that the master and mistress barely noticed her existence, except to marvel occasionally at how flawlessly everything worked under her supervision. But at night, when the lamps were extinguished and the mansion slept, the perfect servant became someone else entirely. She would walk barefoot through the empty corridors, her steps impossibly light on the polished wood, the flicker of a single candle dancing across the scar on her face. Her fingers would trail lightly along the edges of the portraits. The patriarch with his steel eyes, the matriarch with her fine pearls, their sons and daughters frozen in painted youth. And then she would whisper to herself, the quiet words dissolving into the silence like smoke. She spoke of the past, of the blood that had soaked the earth outside, and of the promises made in darkness that she would keep. In the kitchen, her knives waited. She kept them sharp, blades of steel honed to perfection. The hiss of metal on whetstone filled the quiet room each night, a slow, deliberate sound. Her dark eyes glinted in the dim light of an oil lamp. To anyone else, it might have been devotion to her craft, the mark of a dedicated cook. But for her, it was a ritual, a prayer forged in steel, a quiet reminder that patience itself was the sharpest blade of all. The other slaves watched her with a mixture of awe and weariness. To them, she was untouchable, a figure both fearsome and admirable. She never raised her voice, never lost her temper, yet there was something in her gaze that made even the most defiant servant bow their head and step aside. They whispered about her behind her back, about the way her eyes seemed to see through every lie, about how her scarred face never changed, no matter the chaos around her. Some said she was blessed, others swore she was cursed, but they all knew it was best to stay out of her way. To the Harringtons, she remained an enigma. They thought they knew her. They mistook her silence for devotion, her composure for gratitude. They praised her loyalty, bestowing small, occasional gifts upon her, a new pair of shoes, a soft piece of fabric for a dress. Their rarest indulgence was allowing her to stand in the corner of the dining room during large parties. They never realized that every kindness they offered only deepened the fire of resentment that churned beneath her placid exterior. She accepted everything with downcast eyes and her familiar, polite smile, while silently counting the days, the years, the heartbeats that brought her closer to the moment she had long been waiting for. Sometimes, when the mansion was empty of guests and a quiet settled over the property, she would stand at the edge of the porch, looking out at the tobacco fields stretching to the horizon. The land looked different in the dark, stripped of its false beauty, stark and endless. She remembered running barefoot through these same fields as a child, her laughter swallowed by the vast sky, before the gunshots came and turned everything to silence. Out there, in the heavy quiet of the night, she could almost hear their voices on the wind, her mother's soft humming, her father's deep laugh, carried on the night air. But she didn't cry. She never cried anymore. The small, trembling girl had been replaced by a woman of quiet calculation. She understood the power of patience and the sharpness of silence. Every day, she wore her perfect mask, the polite smile, the soft voice, the careful obedience, and every night, she took it off in the quiet of the kitchen, where the knives gleamed like silver secrets and the walls seemed to remember everything. The Harringtons never suspected her loyalty. Why would they? She never gave them a reason to. She ran their house flawlessly, kept their sordid secrets, and tended to their every need with the grace of someone born to serve. When friends visited, they would boast of her skill, her silence, her loyalty. She's family, they would say, their voices warm with pride, never realizing that to her, the word meant nothing. Her family had been buried in the earth years ago, under a sunset and the crack of a gun. In the rare moments she allowed herself to imagine a future, it was never one built on escape. She did not dream of leaving the mansion or running to a distant city where no one knew her name. No, her dreams were quieter, sharper. She dreamed of a balancing of the scales, of the slow, calculated collapse of the life they had built on the bones of her family. She dreamed of the day their laughter would die, their voices would fall silent, and this house would be as empty and cold as her own heart. And so the days turned into nights, and the nights into years, and she waited. She learned every corner of the mansion, every creaking floorboard, every secret tucked behind heavy doors. She memorized the family's habits, when they ate, when they slept, when they left the house unattended. She mapped their lives with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose but time. Her patience was as sharp and steady as the blade she honed each night in the darkness. By the time her 26th birthday passed unnoticed, the transformation was complete. She was no longer the broken, silent girl they had taken in. She was something else now, a woman sharpened by grief and forged by years of quiet observation. On the surface, she was still the perfect servant, grateful and loyal, with a gentle smile and a steady voice. But underneath, in the quiet hours, when the mansion slept and the moonlight streamed through the kitchen window, her dark eyes glinted with a cold and certain resolve. She had not forgotten, and she would never forget. The first death came in silence. It was an evening like any other, the house glowing with a warm, amber light, and the sound of laughter echoing around the long dining table. The eldest son sat at the head of the table, tall and gaunt, his cruel smile highlighted by the glittering chandelier above. He had always been the loudest one, the one who barked orders at the slaves, the one who took without asking, the one who believed the house and everything in it, including her, belonged to him. That night, the roast was tender, the vegetables perfectly seasoned, the sauce rich and smooth. She moved silently around the table, refilling wine glasses, replacing empty plates, her hands as steady as ever. As she passed behind his chair, her dark eyes lingered for just a second, a cold, fleeting glance that no one noticed. Hours later, the house was silent again. The laughter had died, the lights had dimmed, and somewhere upstairs, a heavy body collapsed to the floor with a dull, ugly thud. By the time the others rushed to his room, he was still. His face was pale, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with the horror of a death he never saw coming. They called it an apoplexy. They summoned the doctor, whispering of a sudden seizure, a weak heart, an unlucky fate. Master Harrington paced the halls in silence, his boots thudding heavily on the polished floors. The mistress clutched her crucifix with trembling fingers, her sharp voice breaking as she gave orders no one dared to disobey. The slaves moved in silence, furtively making the sign of the cross when they thought no one was looking. But she did not stop. Every morning, she rose before the sun, her routine unbroken. The fire was lit, the bread dough was kneaded, and the meals were prepared with the same care, the same flawless precision. She hummed softly as she worked, a low, mournful tune that echoed through the quiet halls, steady and unnervingly serene. And as she moved through the house, as she watched their fear grow thicker and heavier, she knew this was only the beginning. Death, she believed, was a dish best served slowly, seasoned with patience. The house was no longer a home. What had once been a bastion of rigid order and family pride had begun to rot from the inside, though no one dared to name the sickness. Weeks had passed since the first death, and now fear had settled over the mansion like an invisible fog. It clung to the walls, soaked into the air, and seeped into the quietest corners. The mirrors were the first to go. One morning, without explanation, the mistress ordered all the servants to cover every mirror in the house with black cloth, muttering about ill omens and restless spirits. Soon, every reflective surface in the house was shrouded, the black cloths hanging like silent warnings. The slaves whispered among themselves, making the sign of the cross whenever they passed a covered mirror, but she said nothing. She simply moved through the house with her calm precision, her dark eyes sharp and unblinking, taking note of every sign of the coming collapse. By the second month, the candles began to burn through the night. Every hallway, every room was lit with the faint, flickering glow of dozens of tapers. Wax pooled on the floors, the air grew thick with the smell of smoke and melting wax, heavy and oppressive. The Harringtons said it was to keep the darkness at bay, though they couldn't explain why the darkness terrified them so. At night, the house hummed with a low, simmering anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards was amplified, every shadow stretched long and distorted on the flickering walls. And then the weeping began. It started with the daughter, a girl of 17, who began to wake in the night, her sobs echoing through the halls. At first, the family dismissed it as grief, but soon others began to hear things. Low voices whispering just behind the walls, footsteps where no one should be, a soft, ghostly laugh that vanished the moment anyone worked up the courage to investigate. Fear twisted its way through the house until even the bravest slaves refused to enter certain rooms after sundown. One by one, the family members began to fall ill. It was subtle at first, a fever here, a headache there, but the sickness spread like a toxic phantom across the plantation. Their skin grew clammy, their eyes sunken, and uncontrollable tremors ran through their once steady hands. The doctor came and went, his visits growing more frequent, but never fruitful. He spoke of stress, of miasma from the swamp, of things he could not explain, and left with his pockets full of gold and the sour stench of fear clinging to him. The daughter was the first to have a seizure, her body locked up in the middle of a warm afternoon. As the family ate in suffocating silence, she collapsed to the floor, foam frothing at her lips, her limbs jerking as the room erupted in screams. They carried her upstairs, her body slick with sweat, her breath shallow and ragged. The master bellowed orders, the mistress clutched her crucifix, and the slaves scurried back and forth. Their fear was so thick it made the air heavy and hard to breathe. And through it all, she remained calm. She moved silently, her apron still pristine, her steps unhurried. She brought cool cloths for fevered brows, bowls of herbal tea that went untouched, and murmured prayers that soothed no one but seemed to keep the room from completely falling apart. She was everywhere and nowhere at once, a phantom in a servant's form, her presence steady, her dark eyes unblinking as she watched the house crumble. By the fourth month, the hallucinations took hold. The mistress swore she saw her dead son standing in the hallway, his face pale and his eyes empty, watching her from the foot of the stairs. She screamed until she was hoarse, then locked herself in her room, refusing to come out unless she thought no one was looking. The youngest son swore he heard whispers in the walls, voices calling his name in the dead of night. Even Master Harrington, who had once ruled the house with an iron fist, grew pale and jumpy, startled by shadows, his confidence rotting away piece by piece. The slaves moved through their days like ghosts. Their faces were drawn, their hands trembling as they tried to keep the house running under the weight of the fear. Some begged to leave, but the mistress wouldn't allow it, insisting they needed everyone close, that the sickness and the shadows would follow anyone who dared to leave. And so they stayed, imprisoned by fear, their whispers growing quieter with each passing day. At night, the house seemed to breathe differently. The flickering candlelight made the halls seem alive, the shadows bending and writhing on the walls like restless spirits. A distant weeping would filter through the thick walls, sometimes soft and mournful, sometimes sharp and raw. Doors would creak open and shut on their own. Footsteps echoed down empty corridors, and the smell of sickness mingled with the acrid scent of wax and smoke until the very air tasted of decay. And through it all, she moved in silence. She walked the halls with a steady, even pace, her face a mask, her dark eyes glinting in the dim light as she passed the rooms where the Harringtons lay. Their bodies shivered with fever, their lips cracked with thirst. She brought them bowls of water, clean cloths, and trays of carefully prepared food they no longer had the strength to eat. She spoke softly when she had to, her voice smooth and even, the same calm tone that had lulled them into believing she was nothing more than a devoted servant. But when their eyes were closed, when their bodies were still, and the house fell into that heavy, suffocating quiet, her gaze would harden. She would linger in the doorways, her hand resting lightly on the wooden frame, her unblinking eyes taking in their suffering. She watched them beg for mercy in raw, broken voices, watched them clutch at each other in the delirium of their hallucinations, watched them tremble and whisper apologies to ghosts who would never answer. No one noticed her terrifying stillness. No one saw the cold satisfaction in her eyes as the sickness deepened, as the fear tightened around the house like a noose. They were too lost in their own terror, too blinded by the shadows, dancing in every corner. In the quiet of the kitchen, when the mansion was asleep and the candles had burned low, she would sharpen her knives. The hiss of metal on whetstone echoed softly through the empty halls. It was a sound no one questioned anymore, just another whisper in a house already full of them. She worked slowly, methodically, her hands steady, her breathing even. The rhythmic scrape of metal was as precise as a heartbeat, cold and unforgiving. By the 6th month, the mansion was unrecognizable. The gardens outside were overgrown with weeds that snaked through the once manicured hedges. Dust gathered in the formerly gleaming corners, the air thick with rot and smoke. The Harringtons were confined to their rooms, their strength failing, their paranoia thick and suffocating. They mumbled of curses, of sins finally come to collect, of the ghosts of the dead returned for their due. She listened to it all, silent and still, her dark eyes sharp and watchful. She knew better than to believe in curses. What haunted this house was not a restless spirit, but something quieter, far more deliberate. It was her. And every day, as the sickness worsened and the house sank deeper into fear, she reminded herself of the promise she had made so long ago, that she would watch, that they would suffer, and that when the end came, it would come slowly, carefully, until there was nothing left but silence. The house had fallen impossibly quiet, its walls heavy with the weight of death and the lingering smell of sickness. What had once been a proud, bustling home was now little more than an empty shell. The halls were dimly lit by dying candles, the rooms filled with a silent, cloying dread. The few remaining slaves moved like ghosts, their voices whispers, their eyes downcast, afraid to look at her as she passed. The very air seemed thick with anticipation, as if the house itself knew the final act of this slow, deliberate play was about to begin. The patriarch of the Harrington family lay in his bed, the man who had once ruled this plantation with his voice and his gaze, now little more than a trembling, skeletal form swallowed by heavy blankets. His skin, once tanned from long days on horseback, was now a pale, waxy yellow, stretched tight over his bones like parchment. His eyes darted around the room, as if searching for an escape, but there was none. Fear clung to him like a second skin, the quiet kind of fear that comes only when a man finally realizes his power is gone. That time and retribution have found him in the one place he thought he was untouchable. The door opened almost soundlessly, the soft brush of her shoes on the wooden floor breaking the stillness. She entered the room, her form steady in the dim light, her dark apron still impeccably smooth, her hair pulled back neatly. In her steady hands was a small tray, and on it a single bowl of broth. Steam rose in thin, delicate wisps, carrying the faint scent of herbs and slow-simmered stock, filling the room with an almost cruel warmth in its comfort. She moved with a quiet grace, crossing the space between them with measured, deliberate steps. Her dark eyes were locked on his with an intensity that seemed to thicken the air. She set the tray gently on the bedside table, every movement careful, precise, as if this were any other evening, any other meal prepared for the man who had believed himself a god in his own house. Then she sat in the wooden chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture serene, her gaze unwavering. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint whistle of the wind through the cracks in the old window frame, and his own shallow, ragged breathing. He stared at her, his dry lips trembling as if to form words, but none came. And yet, in that moment, he knew. He knew what was happening, even if the part of his mind clouded by fever and regret was still trying to deny it. Still, when she reached out and lifted the bowl of broth, her expression calm, almost gentle, and offered the spoon toward him, he parted his cracked lips and swallowed. The broth was warm, rich, and deceptively simple. It went down his throat like a forgiveness he had never earned. Her dark eyes never left his, sharp and steady, glinting in the faint candlelight as if lit from within. She said nothing at first. She just watched, silent, patient, as he took another spoonful, his trembling hands trying to steady the bowl as if it were the last lifeline in a world that had come completely undone. When his eyes met hers, a cold, brutal truth finally passed between them, a wordless understanding that whatever was left of him now belonged entirely to her. "I told you," she said softly, her voice smooth, almost delicate, as if sharing a secret, not delivering a sentence. "I never forget." The silence that followed was suffocating. The walls seemed to press in, the shadows gathered in the corners, and the single candle on the table flickered as if caught in an unseen storm. His breath hitched, a faint, uneven sound. For a moment, he looked like a man facing the sum of all his sins. She sat perfectly still, her face a mask, her hands still folded in her lap, patiently waiting for the broth to do its quiet, inevitable work. Minute passed. He coughed weakly, the last of his strength draining away, his voice breaking into desperate, wordless whispers. His eyes darted around the room as if seeing the faces of those who had gone before him. His son, his daughter, the ghosts of a broken family waiting for him in the corners, silent and judging. She did not move, did not flinch, offered no comfort. She simply watched, her dark eyes calm and steady, until his gaze found hers again and held, locked in a silent, terrible acknowledgement of all that had been done. When the bowl slipped from his trembling hands and clattered softly onto the wooden floor, she didn't look down. She only leaned forward slightly, just enough for her shadow to fall across his gaunt face, and whispered once more, almost tenderly, "I told you." His lips moved again, as if to say her name, but whatever sound he might have made died in his throat. His chest rose and fell in one last, ragged breath, and then the room was still. The candle flickered, its flame dancing for a moment before steadying, and in that stillness, the very weight of the house seemed to shift. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked shut on its own, and the silence that followed was absolute, suffocating in its completeness. She sat there for a long time, her posture still straight, her face serene, the dim light casting her shadow long and thin against the wall. There was no rush, no drama. Revenge, after all, was not an act of haste. When she finally rose, she moved with the same silent precision she always had, her steps impossibly light as she crossed the room. She bent and pulled the blanket up over his face, her hands steady, almost gentle, as if placing a final period on a long sentence. The room now smelled of herbal broth, of candle wax, and of the cold, metallic scent of an end that could not be avoided. She paused in the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the wooden frame, her eyes sweeping over the room one last time. Then she turned and walked away, her form swallowed by the dim light of the hall, her footsteps even, the silence unbroken. This house, once filled with the laughter and voices of those who believed themselves eternal, was now quiet, left with only echoes and memories, and the steady presence of a woman who never forgot, who had waited for this moment with the patience of stone. Downstairs, the kitchen waited. The knives gleamed faintly in the low light, the scent of herbs still lingering in the air. She moved through the familiar space like a ghost come home. Her hand brushed over the smooth wood of the table, over the polished handles of the knives that had been her companions in the long, quiet hours of the night. She set the tray down, washed the empty bowl with meticulous care, and dried it until it shone. When she finally stepped outside, the cool night air was a balm on her skin. The moon hung heavy and low over the endless tobacco fields that stretched away from the house. She stood there for a long time, the silence of the land merging with the silence in her chest, her dark eyes fixed on the horizon, as if searching for something only she could see. The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying the scent of damp earth and memory. She closed her eyes, letting it all wash over her. The house stood behind her, a dark silhouette, its windows black, its walls heavy with the burden of all they had witnessed. Inside, the last breath of the man who had built it still lingered, fading into the wood and stone, into the quiet that would forever hold his absence. And she, the girl who had once been small and broken, now stood alone. Her silence was no longer a wound, it was a crown. The plantation was silent now, a quiet that pressed on the skin and seeped into the bones, as if the very Virginian earth had been holding its breath for years, waiting for this moment. The Harrington family was gone, every last one, buried in the land they had claimed as their kingdom. Their voices were now just whispers lost to the wind. The papers had been signed. A grasping lawyer had finalized the legalities without contest. The entirety of the Harrington estate and its lands were now transferred to her name. The lawyer, a stiff man in a black coat with a practiced smile, had carefully explained the figures, the wills, the accounts, but she had said very little. She had nodded, her dark eyes steady, the same calm that had carried her through years of silent retribution, now enveloping her like a second skin. When it was done, when the last document bore her signature, a sharp, deliberate script she had taught herself in secret, she walked alone through the vast rooms of the house that had once been theirs. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the emptiness, a sharp, cold sound against the polished wood. The portraits still hung on the walls, their painted eyes following her as she moved. She paused before each one, looking directly into the frozen faces of those who had raised her in a cage of guilt and arrogance. She stood there for a long time, saying nothing. Then she turned away, her steps slow and deliberate, her silence as heavy as the house itself. The remaining slaves avoided her eyes. They had been there for all of it, had seen the family grow sick and pale and afraid, had heard the whispered prayers in the corners of the night as the walls creaked and the candles burned down. Now, they made the sign of the cross whenever she passed. Their voices lowered to whispers, their eyes were always downcast, a sharp, sour fear hanging in the air around her. They whispered that the house was cursed, that the land was haunted, that no good could come of staying here. Perhaps they were right. Or perhaps they were simply too afraid to face the truth. She didn't care. She didn't need their fear, their trembling deference. She didn't need anyone. One by one, she freed them. There were no arguments, no farewells, no explanations. She gathered them in the main hall, her form still and quiet at the foot of the grand staircase, and told them they were free. She gave each of them some money and told them to leave. Her voice was calm, even, each word sharp and final. They stared at her for a moment, wide-eyed and silent, before doing as she said. Some left quickly, clutching their few possessions, their steps hurrying as they crossed the threshold for the last time. Others lingered a moment longer, their faces pale, their lips moving in silent prayers before they turned and walked away, their shadows long in the fading light. When the last one was gone, when the house was truly empty, she closed the heavy doors herself and turned the key in the lock. The click of the mechanism echoed through the empty rooms, a final, hollow note that seemed to settle into the bones of the house. She stood there for a moment, her hand resting on the door frame, her dark eyes tracing the familiar lines of the hall, the staircase, the high ceilings that had sheltered her since childhood. It was hers now, every board, every stone, every acre of tobacco that stretched to the horizon like a promise. It was all hers. At night, the emptiness took on a different quality. The house, stripped of all voices and movement, seemed to breathe differently. The wind whistled through the cracks in the old window frames, carrying the distant howl of coyotes and the rustle of leaves in the fields. She would light candles in the dining room, tall white tapers that flickered in the still air, and sit in the master's chair at the head of the long table where she had once stood silently serving meals to people who never truly saw her. The mahogany tabletop gleamed under the soft light, the polished silver set so perfectly that it reflected her face in fractured pieces, the scar on her cheek like a fault line. She would sit there, her back straight, her hands folded before her, and stare at the empty chairs, her dark eyes gleaming in the candlelight like volcanic glass. The nights were long. Sometimes she would pour herself a glass of dark whiskey, the expensive kind the master had favored, and let the burn linger on her tongue. Sometimes she would sit in silence, her gaze fixed on the windows where the moonlight streamed in, painting strange patterns in the dust that had begun to settle in the corners. And sometimes, when the house was too still and the weight of the quiet was crushing, she would whisper to herself. Her voice was almost inaudible, the words devoid of emotion, just a quiet acknowledgement of what she had done and who she had become. Outside, the land was vast and empty, the fields bathed in silver moonlight, the air thick with the smell of dry earth and weeds. She walked the grounds at dawn, her stride steady, her eyes sweeping over the land that was now hers alone. The sun would rise slowly, heavily, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold, and she would stand there, a silhouette against the light, silent and still as the new day began. Field hands on the distant road would glance toward the house and whisper among themselves, their voices low, their eyes wary. No one dared to approach. The plantation was hers, and everyone knew it. The days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. She kept the house in order, her movements precise and efficient, her routine steady and deliberate. She cooked for herself in the same kitchen where she had once labored for others. The sizzle of the hearth and the rhythmic chop of a knife were the only sounds that anchored her in the quiet of the empty house. She still kept her knives sharp, the polished blades catching the light as she cleaned and oiled them, her hands moving with the same care and precision she had always shown. At night, the dining room became her sanctuary. She would light the candles and sit at the head of the table, the silverware gleaming in the soft light, her reflection sharp and fractured on the polished metal. Sometimes she would close her eyes and listen to the stillness, the hum of the house settling around her, the soft whisper of the wind in the fields. Other times, she would sit with her eyes wide open, staring at the empty chairs, her gaze steady, her face unreadable, as if daring the lingering ghosts in the corners to come closer. There were no more voices, no more footsteps, no more laughter echoing down the halls. The house was hers, the land was hers, and this silence was hers. The people who had ruled her were gone, their power turned to dust and memory, their fortune signed away and forgotten. She had taken everything from them, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the quiet and the long, empty rooms that were now hers. And yet, as she sat there at the head of the table, her dark eyes catching the flickering candlelight, there was no smile, no satisfaction, no trace of victory. Only the quiet, the hum of a house finally silenced, and the steady, unblinking gaze of a woman who never forgot and would never forgive. The years passed like sand through fingers, but the land never forgot her mark. Under her steady hand, the plantation changed. What had once been a vast stretch of tobacco grew into an empire of tobacco and corn, its fields stretching farther than the eye could see, its yields growing until the nearby town spoke of her wealth in hushed, respectful tones. She never boasted, never raised her voice, never demanded recognition. She didn't have to. Her presence was enough. When she rode into town, dressed in simple dark fabrics and well-polished boots, the street seemed to fall quiet. Men tipped their hats, women inclined their heads, and children whispered behind their mothers' skirts. They called her the Silent Mistress, a title that clung to her like a second skin. Her wealth grew like a wildfire, but her habits never changed. She still rose before the sun, walking the grounds in the grey light of dawn. Her sharp eyes scanned the fields with the precision of someone who had once memorized this land in silence. She spoke little to the foremen and free laborers who now worked her land, but they followed her orders without question. She paid them fairly, always on time, but her authority was absolute. It was not built on cruelty, but on an unshakable certainty that she had earned everything she possessed. They feared her in the quiet way one fears a coming storm, not for what she said, but for what she didn't have to. In town, her name carried weight. The banks extended her credit without hesitation. The merchants vied for her business, and the men who had once looked down on her now spoke of her with a wary respect. She never attended their gatherings, never danced at their festivals, or took tea in their fine drawing rooms. She preferred the solitude of her land, with the vast Virginia sky above and the steady pulse of the earth beneath her feet. Still, they speculated about her endlessly, whispering stories of the orphan slave girl the Harringtons had taken in, who had somehow inherited everything when they had all, one by one, passed away. Some said she was blessed by God. Others swore she was cursed, that the house was haunted, and that her silence was the mark of something unnatural. She never corrected their rumors. She never gave them anything to hold on to. Inside the house, the rooms remained as they had been the day the last of them died. The portraits still hung in their gilded frames, their painted eyes watching her as she moved through the halls. The long dining table was still polished with layers of beeswax, the silver still bright and sharp, though it had not been set for a guest in years. The servants were long gone. The house was hers alone now, vast and empty, echoing with the sound of her own footsteps in the quiet hours of the night. She kept it impeccably clean, every surface free of dust, every corner pristine, as if to let it fall into decay would be to tarnish the very thing she had built from the ashes of their sins. But at night, when the wind blew hard across the fields and rattled the window shutters, she still heard their voices. Her parents, their voices came on the air, thin as smoke, but sharp enough to cut through the stillness of the house. Sometimes it was her mother's gentle humming, the same tune she had sung by the fire in their small cabin, her voice warm and alive. Sometimes it was her father's deep laugh, the sound of safety and protection echoing softly in the corners. And sometimes, when the night was darkest and the wind howled outside the windows, they would call her name, their voices strong and clear, pulling her back to that afternoon on the porch where it had all begun. She never answered. She would stand in the middle of the empty dining room, her bare feet cold on the polished wood, her dark eyes focused on nothing and everything, and listen until the wind died down. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, she would pour herself a glass of dark whiskey, the same kind the patriarch had favored, and take her seat at the head of the table. The candlelight would catch the sharp line of the scar on her face, the puckered, frozen half of a face that time had never softened, and reflect her in fractured pieces in the silver. The town never saw that side of her. To them, she was untouchable, elegant in her simplicity, serene in her silence. They saw the wealth, the vast plantation, and the quiet power that came from a woman who owed no one anything. They did not see the long nights she spent in silence, the way the house seemed to hum with the memories it held, and the way her eyes gleamed in the flickering candlelight, like a blade so sharp it could be nothing but dangerous. Every year, on the anniversary of that night, when the sun sank low and the sky turned the color of old bruises, she would walk the grounds alone. Her hands would brush against the tall grasses, her boots stirring the dry dust. She would stop at the small rise where the Harrington family graves lay, the stone markers clean and white, the ground around them carefully tended. She never spoke, never lingered long, but her presence was enough. It was a silent acknowledgement, not of forgiveness, but of something colder, sharper, a reminder to herself that she had kept her promise, that she had taken everything from them until there was nothing left to take. The plantation thrived with each passing year. The fields of tobacco and corn yielded bountiful harvests, and the money flowed steadily into her accounts. Men came with offers, with business propositions, with partnerships, and with marriage proposals whispered in careful tones. But she refused them all with the same polite, calm finality. She needed no one. She trusted no one. This land, this house, this silence, they were hers, and they were enough. But in the quiet hours, when the wind rose and the sky stretched black and endless over the fields, the weight of it all would settle in her chest. She would sit alone in the dining room, the whiskey glass held loosely in her hand, her posture perfect, her face frozen in the same expression it had worn the night her childhood ended, calm, sharp, and brutally cold. She would raise the glass in a silent toast, to no one and nothing, to the ghosts in the corners, to the voices on the wind, to the girl she had been, and to the woman she had become. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when her dark eyes seemed to soften, when the sharp edges blurred for a single breath, and she would imagine what life might have been if that afternoon had never happened. A small cabin by the fields, her parents alive and well, laughter filling the air instead of this silence. But the thought never lasted. The silent mistress of Virginia did not allow herself the luxury of dreams. She had built her world on a foundation of loss and patience, and there was no room for anything but the truth she carried like a knife in her heart. The townspeople would tell these stories for years to come, of the woman with the scar on her face who ruled a county without a word, of how her gaze could freeze a man in his tracks, of the strange, haunting beauty of the house that stood alone on the horizon, untouched by time or decay. And in every story, there was the same thread, a sense that she was something more than human, that her silence was the language of the land itself, vast, endless, and full of secrets, too deep to name. And when the wind blew hard across the fields, carrying the scent of dust and old blood, they would swear they saw her silhouette, standing at the edge of the porch, a glass raised in a silent, solitary toast, her scar catching the last rays of the dying day, and her dark eyes would gleam like the last shard of a knife against the dying sky.